Hello, my name is Spencer Hay. I am the co-founder and chief science officer at Prism Bio, and welcome to Discussing Data Science. My guest today is Shrawan Patel. Shrawan has long been working at the forefront of digital medicine. He previously worked as a physician for the NHS in London before moving to Mount Sinai in New York to become the clinical transformation lead for the Digital Innovation Center. He's also been an angel investor, a startup advisor. He's owned and operated several businesses, and the list really goes on and on. He is currently managing director at Strategy Health, a boutique consulting firm helping those in the healthcare space to make the most of new digital health technologies. He's also a founding team member and mentorship director for PharmStars, the pharma-focused accelerator for digital health startups. So Shrawan, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Spencer.
So why don't we start with a little bit about your background? I mean, you have this sort of rich backstory here of sort of how you came into the digital health space. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about your journey.
I think my journey has been definitely a little tortuous, maybe, and definitely not straight by any means. Prior to med school, I guess giving the longer story, prior to med school, I started and run a number of businesses. And when I started at med school, what I had been doing academically and what I had done outside of school had always been very separate. And I think I felt med school might be the time to try and bring those things together. Don't think I really found a really good answer to how to do that. But what I did end up doing was working with research labs in spinning tech out. So now my alma mater, Imperial, has a very good tech transfer office and commercialization office. But we're talking 15 odd years ago, and
Right.
I think things were still pretty early. And so there wasn't a good route for research to get out of the lab into the wide world and actually function in a commercial manner. And so I'd worked with a number of research groups in kind of setting up companies, doing a bit of early stage funding, building business plans, etc. And so I think that's what I ended up doing a little bit on and off whilst in the early stages of med school.
Wow.
But I think what really changed was a lot of my best friends from med school weren't actually medics. They were non-medics. They were engineers, chemists, mathematicians, and a lot of them had a big interest in tech. I think it made sense. I went to a STEM-focused university. And so again, 15 odd years ago, they said, you should learn this up-and-coming coding language called Python. You'll never regret the decision. It's going to serve you really well. And I kind of sat there and thought, all right, well, if you say so, I'll do it. And had started to play around and learn Python. I think unless you're in a true tech adjacent or tech field, I think actually when you think of tech and how to make it useful to your needs, you do think about the fact that you do think of websites, for example, and you think of front-end development. And so I realized that actually if I really wanted to build really cool and interesting things, then I needed to also learn JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and just be able to tie things together. And so once upon a time, I wasn't a bad full stack developer, but I think that skill, plus being in London in 2007, 8, right at the early stages of digital health or e-health, m-health as it was called then.
Yeah.
Being a medic, having been involved with businesses from a young age, I think it was just the right person, right time, right place for this early involvement in health tech companies. And so I started to do more and more of that in London. Once I started practicing, took that into the more traditional health provider space. And so when I moved to the States, God knows, 6, 7 years ago, it made complete sense to join a large health system and take the clinical knowledge that I'd built up working as a physician, but then also bring in the tech piece. And so that's when I started working at Sinai and working with the innovation team and starting to think about how digital health solutions are being used across the health system. I then ended up working for a startup that had spun out of the health system and taking that skills into that company. And that began my first forays into working with pharma. So I know I mentioned this to you before this call that we almost by accident or out of the blue had a pharma company reach out saying, we heard you're building something interesting. We'd love to learn more. And I'm sitting there thinking, I have no idea what this person does. They have about 10 bits to their title, right? Global head lead of something or other. Like, what does that actually mean? What do they want? there's just all these questions. And so we really stumbled our way through the first set of conversations, stumbled our way through the contracting process, but managed to get it across the line and kind of parlayed that into the next potential deal, the next deal, and then the next deal. And we ended up having a number of deals. And so that's a lot of the things that I bring to PharmStars that I'll talk about in a moment. And then I took my leave from Sinai and from the startup about 3.5 years ago, which was about the time when my son was born. And I think you can only sit on your hands for so long. So then I very quickly started to work with other health tech firms, taking what I've learned and helping them use that information. And that's how I started Strategy Health. And over time, as clients have grown and as projects have grown, we found our niche working with software as medical device companies. So that's the thing that really spans the whole spectrum. So we span the whole spectrum of software as a medical device. And we do clinical trials. So we design protocols, we write protocols, we think about endpoints. We then do run clinical trials. So we've run two, and I've been the PI on those. We then do a lot of commercial development work. So working with clinical teams, product teams, data science teams in building software as a medical device. FDA applications. So we've done 3. We're working on another 3 at the moment.
Wow.
And then we do commercial work afterwards. So it feels like it's full spectrum and it's a lot, but the theme that marries all of it together is software as a medical device. That's really where our expertise are. And then on the PharmStars side, it's working with digital health companies, helping them understand the pharma space so that they can look at how their products work, what they bring to the table, and position themselves in a way that's going to be of interest to pharma. And then put them in front of the pharmaceutical companies that are members of PharmStars. So we have 7 at the moment. Large companies like Eli Lilly, mid-sized companies like Novo Nordisk, BI, smaller firms like Alexion and Sumitomo, though they're part of bigger firms.
Yeah.
And so those companies then have the opportunity to work with these startups. And the idea is that if you remove the distance between them, you remove some of the language barriers, then deals are more likely to happen. So that's really, the path from med school through to where I am now and what I do.
I mean, that sounds awesome. I mean, as you say, maybe not a straight line, but I don't know that, I mean, does anybody take the straight line to do, I feel cheesy saying this, but it's like, look, if you're innovative, it's like, it's not going to be straight, right? Like you're going to be.
Yeah, it's true. I think there are lots of straight lines to get places. I think there are certain types of people that, maybe decide to take an alternative path.
Yeah. I suppose you could go like, biology, like engineering or whatever, like straight into, there's some path there, right? But if you're kind of, searching around for, what's new, like where are the big opportunities to really kind of do things differently, right? It's just kind of like, you're gonna wind a little bit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on the clinical trial experience a little bit. I mean, I would love to hear you say more about the, trials and tribulations of, software as a medical device, right? Like doing trials like that. I mean, evaluating software for regulatory approval. I mean, it's exciting. We've had guests on the podcast already who sort of, have some experience doing that, but it sounds like it's still kind of, is this fair to say it seems like it's a domain that is still kind of figuring out like how it's going to work exactly? But would love to hear you talk a little bit about your experience there.
I think there are lots of open questions in general when it comes to software as a medical device. Some of the big questions that I think plagued the industry maybe 3 or 4 years ago have now started to close. So things like reimbursement pathways are becoming a little clearer. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that they've been solved or that answers have been found, but I think what the potential answers are becoming clearer. I think the thing that I always think about when we're starting to work with companies is, the thing I've always noticed is that for software as a medical device, and particularly for small startups, there is this there is this contradiction in some respects where if you're a small company and you're building something that would potentially be classified as a software as a medical device, you're still pulling funding from investors that primarily invest in tech, and they will see you as a tech company because you're building software. But the way that a tech company does things and the way that a software as a medical device company, so remove the software, as the way a medical device company works, night and day.
Yeah.
And so I think there is this contradiction where the expectation is one thing, but the reality is something else. And people that end up building these medical device software products are often not thinking about things like compliance, regulatory, commercial until later down the line, right? You can, it's very easy to pull out a slide and say, here is the market opportunity. The market opportunity is big, right? Let's say I come up with a tool that could potentially diagnose, I don't know, asthma attacks, or and let's say you've got a tool that can pick up some disease early. The potential market is huge. But how do you get paid for your product? Like, market sizing is very different from business model. And often business models change, and that's fine. Business models do change, but you need to have at least some clarity around the fact that a business model exists. But for a lot of software as a medical device companies, the business model may not exist. Sometimes it's because healthcare is a little bit weird in the way that it works. I'll give you an example. There's a product that I know very well that's able to diagnose a sleep disorder. You would think that that tool that can be used at home would be a really obvious tool to get used. But kind of one of the big issues is the fact that if the tool gets used, it removes a really big revenue source for most hospitals.
Mm.
So the tool is great and it'll improve patient care, but in the whole patient care spectrum, the bit that hospitals make the most amount of money on is the diagnosis piece, and that's the bit that you're helping with. And so something that's really good clinically is then counter to the financials of the health systems that you're then trying to sell into. And so, like, that's just one example of something that should exist, but the business model just doesn't support it, or it's non-existent almost. So regulatory and compliance is, I think, often left until later down the line. That's a problem with trials. I know we need to get trials. And then commercial is also left behind. But all of those things need to be thought about when you're beginning your protocol development process and you're designing your trial. Because, like, every data scientist knows, right? Shit in is shit out. So the data that you're collecting in your study needs to be the right data to produce the product that you want to build. That you can't retrospectively go back to the patients in your study and say, oh, you know what, we forgot to ask you a question, and we now know that that question is a really important feature in the algorithm, or could be a really important feature in the algorithm. Well, tough luck. It's been and gone. And why that has an impact is that once you have your data, you start to build your product. Your data in many ways defines the type of product you can build. And once you start building your product, you train your algorithm to give certain outputs, and you'll build your wraparound to house your algorithm. And all of those will affect the type of labels and claims you have on your product, will affect the applications of where the product gets used.
Yeah.
From a regulatory standpoint, if you've collected your data in one setting, but you want to have the product used in a different setting, the regulator might say that you have no usability data to show that you can take your algorithm and apply it in a different place. And so there are all these knock-on effects of the data not being collected in the right way means the product doesn't function in the right way, which means what you ended up hoping the product would be can't happen.
Yeah.
And it all begins from the beginning, because if you have any mistakes or issues down the way, you have to go back and redo things because you're working in a regulated environment.
So that's fascinating. Like, I mean, it's interesting too, if you think about like the sort of, to go back to what you were talking about, kind of even in the beginning, right? With like this, the startup wants to develop this software as a medical device, right? Like,
Yep.
but the whatever you want to call it, the received wisdom in startup land, right? It's like, yeah, MVP, iterate, 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 right? It's like, don't wait, to put something out there. It's just like you just got to start, and it just sounds like there's a fundamental tension there too, right? It's like, no, before you can even kind of like get going, you gotta know what you're gonna do, right? I mean, I don't know if you have like that just sounds so challenging. Like, I mean, do you have sort of ideas about how do you solve that? If that, I know maybe that's a totally unfair question, but just curious if you have
I'm not sure that there are ways in which you can, or obvious ways in which you can change that,
mhm.
because the stepwise process, the way regulations and compliance is written, is there for a reason.
Yeah,
And I think actually the reasoning behind a lot of these things is good. And there should be some accountability, and things like GMP should be followed, and people should have a QMS, and like they're there for a reason. But those also mean that doing iterative changes and moving fast and breaking things also is not really that easy to do.
yeah.
But I think there is opportunity for, I guess, changing the approach a little bit.
Hmm.
So one of the things that we do with startups is help them realize and build studies that are actually really low cost and low burden. I think people think of clinical trials and they think of the 5, 10, $20 million pharma trials.
Yep.
But what they don't realize is that they could go to any clinician. Like, actually, clinicians don't even need to be PIs. A PI just needs to be someone that is appropriate to run the study or to head the study. So you need someone that can act and function as your PI. And it doesn't really matter that much who that person is. You don't need the top surgeon at Mayo Clinic to be your PI. You just need to find, if you're building something for the surgical space, you just need to find a surgeon that would be willing to do it. And then you build your protocol, you go through your IRB process. That's going to be at the institution, or if it's a decentralized trial, you have a central IRB. I think people don't realize that. I think doing a protocol submission through some of the most common IRBs is going to be, a few $1,000s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you'll have some extra bits of documentation that are going to cost, a couple of $100 each, but like overall, to get your trial through ethics is going to cost, let's say, $6,000, $7,000. Plus your PI, plus all the tech and all the build is on your end. There are now companies like Medieval, Caster, these EDC companies that can actually do pretty good things at a low cost. And so running and putting together a study doesn't have to be $1 million affair. So you can run small scale studies and you can pull basic data. And then you get into the data science principles, because you can do things like cross-validation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can both train and test on the same data set. So that's not really med device specific. That's, I guess, data science specific. But you can take a relatively small data set and have, pretty good finger in the air tell or guess as to, yeah, we think there's something there. You can then open that data, have it as an open label study, look at the data as it's coming in, and then do the move fast and break things data science process, right? So you're doing your algorithm development in that fashion as you'd want to, but it's in a trial database, in a trial setting. But you're also doing that knowing that it's deliberately small, and you're going to have to do a bigger version, because if you're doing cross-fold, it's not a prospective assessment, right? So you need to do that. And to get it through a regulatory pathway, you need to have done a prospective assessment. But you have enough data to be confident that you can do a larger pilot study to collect more data. You then build that study based on what needs to be the case for your final product. And then you might build in another arm that is made up of a blinded data set that you can then do a prospective assessment on. So there are clever ways of doing it, but I think it's a set of skills and a knowledge base that's still building up.
Yeah.
Fast forward 5 years, 10 years, and I think things like that, or that way of thinking, will be a lot more common. And then the world's I think the oyster.
Where do you think like the regulators are as far as like their ability to handle this, to, I mean, it sounds like a contradiction in terms to innovate, but like, yeah, where do you see them sort of sitting as far as like, are they going to be ready for this as the volume starts to ramp up?
So I actually just saw somewhere a little headline saying that the FDA felt that they might not be prepared yet. So
Okay.
I read something saying that the FDA probably isn't as prepared as it would like to be. I don't know. I think, is it not part of the job description of regulators to constantly play catch up? Like just outside of healthcare, just every regulator is always playing catch up. And I don't think that's any different for the FDA. It will play catch up, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's just the way that the world works. But in the last couple of years, they've been incredibly open around building the digital centers for excellence, center of excellence of trialing things like the pre-certification program, preset program, then increasing number of guidances focused on AI, focused on software as a medical device. There was actually one released not long ago. And then there are multiple guidances coming out. And each time they're iterating and they're getting better. I've definitely noticed through pre-subs that the guidance and the ability to have a conversation with regulators has improved drastically.
Great.
So it's like they're actually doing quite a lot, and I give them credit and hats off to them for really being open to the process, knowing that this is coming, that they have to be part of that process, part of the conversation. The FDA is having conversations with startups, with industry organizations to understand the space, to understand where things are heading, to be able to try and come up with rules and regulations that are not overly constrictive, but are also doing the job that's necessary. I think lots of people forget that the primary role of the FDA is focused on safety.
Mm-hmm.
We always think about efficacy, and efficacy is part and parcel of that, but safety is the primary goal.
Yeah.
That you aren't meant to prove to the FDA that you don't have to necessarily prove all the time that you are the best of the best in terms of product efficacy. What you do have to show is that your product is safe. Like that's an absolute requirement. So I think that's what FDA is trying to grapple with, and it's a tough task.
Yeah.
Because do all algorithms have to be locked when they go in? So algorithms locked goes to the FDA, and then the product that gets launched or approved and goes on market is the locked product. But then how does that work with product improvement and product development? Do you allow algorithms to self-learn and change? But then if you do, how do you deal with that in a safe mechanism? And that's part and parcel of what the pre-cert program was looking at was, do you pre-certify companies to say that they meet certain expectations and they can have a little bit more breathing room to go through product development cycles and release products into the community? Do you start to focus more on real-world evidence generation and real-world evidence requirements? So if you think about some of the requirements for drugs, do you allow a product to go on market? And do you say that there are caveats to allow the product on market, allow the product to change, but you have to constantly be showing to the FDA that the product is safe?
I see.
Real
like accelerated approval. Is that what you're thinking of? Yeah. That's what.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like, again, I don't envy the FDA.
Yeah.
But from what I've seen, hats off to them. Then, like they're open and they're trying, and I think they're doing the right things.
All right. Why don't we transition now? We have our three standard questions that we like to ask everybody. So question the first, what do you see as the biggest data gaps out there in the field? The things where you're like, if only we could close this, right?
Oh, we had this conversation before. I think for me, because I've worked in a few different places, and I do work in a few different places, I think the answer to that question depends on who you're talking about.
Yeah.
So from a startup perspective, if you're a startup, so thinking about software as a medical device, if you're a startup and you're trying to build a product, you have an idea. I think one of the biggest data gaps that is moving, like it is, things are heading in the right direction, is actually just the availability of open access databases.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an idea, you want to see if there's if there's a possibility that it could work, then how do you gather the data to try it out? Well, you have to do a data collection or you have to run a study, and that's expensive and time consuming and everything else involved. Whereas there are organizations like Sage Biosciences. So Sage is doing quite a lot of work to put together these open access data sets that you can then get a hold of and you can use and you can analyze and you can see whether or not there are things there that might lead to cool and interesting new products.
Yeah.
Like the number of databases that are being produced and being given out for this use case is increasing. But I think from a startup perspective, like that's something that is definitely missing. Is how do you even test an idea?
Yeah.
From a pharma perspective, there are lots of data gaps, but there was actually a company from the last cohort of PharmStars that I had worked with, and we'd come up with this really nice idea around the capability gap. So one of the capability gaps for pharma is how do you answer medium complexity and medium value questions? I think pharma's whole business model revolves around asking questions and then running studies to find answers and build drugs.
All right.
Some of those are going to be really complicated and really valuable questions, and they're going to be high level. And you answer those with multi-million-dollar clinical studies. There are other questions that you'll have that are lower level questions, have some value, and can be answered quite nicely through registries or through real-world evidence. But what about all the mid-level questions that can't be answered by RWE or through registries, aren't really worth spending multi-millions of dollars on clinical trials? Like they're just left, they're valuable, but you don't really have easy ways of answering them.
Yeah.
I think that's a big capability gap and a big data gap, because how does pharma get the data to answer those questions?
What would you think of as, sorry to interrupt, just what would be like an example of a middle level question?
Good question. So I think examples of mid-level questions would be things like, let's say, quantifying unmet needs in patient populations.
Okay.
So the patients using existing therapies, like actually being able to quantify the unmet needs is more of an active process. So you might be able to get that through a clinical study, but there are also confounders for that. Yep. You might use other traditional methods like focus groups, etc., but there's still, you've got a small n, and even that's kind of confounded. Right. RWE is not going to answer that question, but that has value because that might help you develop evidence to support market access negotiations. Or, for example, questions around drivers behind med adherence, right? Again, not really easy to answer through RWE, probably not worth spending money on a trial. There are other mechanisms, but they have their downsides. Large language models, like the ChatGPT craze that we're currently in, I think has been driving lots of interest in pharma because it suddenly gives you this ability to answer some of these mid-level questions that haven't really been able to be answered nicely until now. And I have my own thoughts and kind of, I guess, questions about a lot of these companies and a lot of these products. But I think, but the point is that it's of interest because it suddenly gives pharma this ability to answer these types of questions.
Question 2. What excites you most about the future of research?
So of research itself, I think trials, the way trials have been designed hasn't really changed a lot. Mm-hmm. There have been a group of individuals that for a long time have really championed decentralized trials. the Craig Lipsitz of the world. And I think now with COVID and a whole bunch of other things, the idea and concept of decentralized trials has been growing. I think it's still really small, and most pharma companies are still pushing out very traditional looking trial protocols. But decentralized trials is really cool. It's really interesting. It does a ton to increase access, to increase diversity within trials, removes patient burden. I mean, there are just so many positives of it. There are inherent issues, and I could talk for days on the issues having run decentralized trials, but there are loads and loads of positives that I think are good for the industry. And then there's also, I think, the tech, the trial space hasn't really, so the trial protocols haven't really changed, and then the tech and the tools used to run trials have also barely changed. And then suddenly, in the last 5+ years, you have companies like Medivol and Castor, and so there are a bunch of these companies all over the place that have started to spring up and have electronic data capture systems and have e-consent systems, and they have patient management systems for trials. There was a company from the first PharmStars cohort that you guys were with called Seascape. Mm-hmm. They have an awesome tool to be able to pull data from lots of different databases into one single Excel type of file. Because we forget that people are running clinical trials, ClinOps teams are running trials or helping to run and manage trials. They almost on a daily basis will get the question of, okay, where are we with the recruitment? How many patients are currently enrolled? What are the enrollment numbers like? How have those been tracking? It's like all of this data, those are the questions they get asked on almost a daily basis. But to be able to answer that question, you need an up-to-date database, which means that you need to pull your lab data, you need to pull your EDC data, you need to pull your e-consent data, you need to pull your individual site-specific data, you need to pull some potentially patient record data. There are just lots of disparate databases you need to pull data from to be able to fill in your master data set. You can then run your macros and you can push out an answer. So how many hours are spent just aggregating data to be able to answer these questions that ClinOps teams get on a daily basis? So companies like Seascape have these great tools that are just making trials run quicker, more efficiently. I think that can't be a bad thing. It's definitely a good thing. On the software as a medical device space, just the types of products that are being tested in trials right now. If you look and you read through some of the study titles and you read the studies on clinicaltrials.gov and look at what they're actually building, it's sci-fi level stuff. It's disease diagnosis from images and from voice data and cough data and from wearable data, right? There's a company, the GPX, that has a bloodless blood test, and they're using that and they're associating it with proBNP, which is a heart failure marker. I mean, there's just tons of these really cool things that is currently being tested and trialed, and I think that's cool.
All right, question 3. If you could wave the magic wand, what do you think you would change?
This is going to sound dull, but I think it's also because, and it would actually, in some ways, it would cannibalize what I do for a living. But if I could change anything, it would be actually to increase the amount of cross-functional, cross-team conversation and knowledge exchange.
Interesting.
Because you'll have clinical teams that don't necessarily know that much about data science. And the data scientists won't do a lot to explain to the clinical teams how products are built or how algorithms are built. And then there'll be clinical teams, and there'll be data science teams that will go through a study data set. And study data sets are theoretically the cleanest type of medical data you can get a hold of. And by traditional data science standards, they are still very messy.
Yeah.
So as data scientists, you look at a trial data set and you think, like the number of times I've seen data, and no disrespect to data scientists, but they'll run a script through the whole database, basically taking the labels and saying, well, okay, I just need to run the same script and just follow it through. And then the results come out and it's just not what you're expecting. And it's because no conversation has happened with the clinical team about the nuances of the individual patients or the individual subjects within the data set. So there are subgroups that you can't just run one script across the whole thing and just expect you to be able to pull the data and start playing with it. It's one database, but it's actually made up of about 10, 11 different subgroups. And those subgroups are based on clinical things. Like it might be that the site where patients were recruited actually plays into some of the data. Let's say that you're using voice data.
Right.
Then like the location makes a difference. And data scientists know that that's the case, but don't necessarily know like how that feeds into the data set as a whole, whereas the clinical team does know that. And then the product team won't necessarily know about the regulatory piece, and they'll start building a product and building and giving directions around what a product should do and how it should function to be the best product for the end user, the patient. But by doing so, they then introduce labels and claims that are just never going to get through the regulatory process. And so there is this whole bunch of conversation that I think should be happening all the time to just make the whole product development process smooth. And right now, it's kind of non-existent for most companies.
Well, Shrawan, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to say before we conclude?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot.
Yeah.
It's been a fun conversation. So just thank you for having me. It's been great.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I've learned a lot. This was fascinating. So really appreciate your time. And thanks to the audience. Please hit like and subscribe to never miss an episode, and we'll see you in the next one.